Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to use my professor voice a little bit here, but it is a pleasure to be here. We are thrilled to be co-hosting this with Dory and the Institute. And I think one of the reasons that it makes it so easy is that the Institute's mission, and I will read it, is very much about promoting servant leadership and organizational practices that contribute to a more just, caring, and equitable world. And I think this is the reason why we're gathered here today is really, what does that actually mean in practice? How do we actually do it beyond the rhetoric and beyond the theory? And how can we move collectively to that just and more caring world? We at the partnership think about harnessing innovation for shared economic prosperity. So you can see how these two organizations are very much aligned. And we've talked a lot about how we can work together. But even beyond that, within the Georgia Tech borders, we also have to create partners externally. And I am so thrilled and honored and pleased to be welcoming Téne, who is a friend and colleague. And we're so excited to talk about this. That we coordinated our outfits. So we were very much like, what are you wearing? What shoe? What is the color? And so we want to make sure this is a dynamic duo type conversation. But also, it's because I think we all have much to learn from Téne in terms of how she practices servant leadership, both in the philanthropy space, in the civic space, in the nonprofit space, and how she's been fighting the good fight for over 2 decades. And so I think she will share a lot of what works, what doesn't, and really have an honest conversation and dialogue. It's a really critical and challenging time right now. I just want to make sure we acknowledge and kind of respect that, but that doesn't mean that we should stop fighting. And this is very much part of those greater efforts. So without further ado, Téne, who are you? What do you do? And why are you here?
Because you asked me to be here. I am, well, first of all, thank y'all for having me. It's such an honor to be on campus. I have another gig that I do at another school in Atlanta, and I'm always delighted to be in a learning environment. It just brings such joy to me. So my name is Téne Traylor. I am a daughter of the state of Georgia. I'm an Atlanta girl all the way through. So anybody wants old school Atlanta information, I'm here for that. So I am a both of my parents are from Alabama. So they're both from different parts, but of very humble beginnings. I was having this conversation yesterday, and to say I come from a line of folks in the helping profession and in the building work, right? So my mom's as we say in the South, my mom's people, my grandmother and such were some of my great grandmother was a domestic. My grandfather was a builder. So I feel that I have hopefully harnessed a career that pays homage to both the way they've really helped stand up their families and communities, but also help build and be very entrepreneurial, which is what kind of I think the work that I do right now in supporting communities around social change.
And tell me a little bit about the work that you do and why you do it.
Well, and very specifically, I lead the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute, which is headquartered in DC. And in that role, I work alongside an amazing group of researchers that really help support a conversation and a narrative about what's happening throughout the social sector. So whether we're looking at charitable giving, whether we're looking at the infrastructure aspects of the social sector, whether we're looking at working directly with partners and change makers around areas that they want to improve, we do advising, some adaptive learning skills or technical assistance. We do kind of a wide range of work, but ultimately we are really trying to figure out what is the role of social sector in society. And we kind of move bodies of work, research, case studies, statistical data to help shape that conversation.
And like beyond your credentials, which are extraordinary, and your experiences, which are equally so, I know an important driver to you and your work is improving equity. That is essentially your North Star. Given the state of the world that we live in, equity, what does equity mean now in this changing, complex, dynamic society? And what is required for us to be in a more equitable and just world?
Pretty easy question. I would say that, for me, this conversation around equity can be extremely broad, right? Like, what is equitable for everyone? What is just for everyone? And ultimately, I think we want that. I think we want collective prosperity. We want everyone to have the opportunity to live the life that they want to pursue. For me, the definition of equity pretty much is unchanged. For me, I work very explicitly from a racial equity perspective. And for me, it's when race is no longer a predictor of one's outcomes in life. So as it relates to being an African-American woman, there are aspects of who and what I am that in so many ways I represent kind of beating those statistical odds. And that's not actually the way it should be. It should be where, despite my race, I should have the same opportunities as anyone else who is not my race. We have had a default culture of white society, and that is by design. But those indicators of success, whether it's educational attainment, whether that's health outcomes, whether that's educational outcomes, it runs, whatever that is, oftentimes the disparity gap between folks that look like me and folks that do not is wide, and it's unexplained, and it's disproportionate. And we need to address that. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to address that. So for me, equity is work where we begin to unpack not only the why, but the remedy for why it is the way it is. And that takes all of us. That doesn't take just people who look like me to address this. This is everyone that wakes up in the morning and asks themselves, like, is everyone around me having a fair chance to succeed in life? And then what can I do to make it just? That's kind of the work that I do. It's broader than that.
And tell me more about the remedy and what we must do to address this.
There's not, unfortunately, I wish it was just one thing. You can take some penicillin and then it's all gone away, but that's not how it works. But I do think there's a very micro level of addressing equity on an everyday level, which is, what are the opportunities that you see that you can address day to day? Sometimes in a civic society, that could be voting for the people and causes and issues that will help change and shift conditions for people. Very, at a macro level, is paying attention to when those people that you voted into and elected, how do you hold them accountable for what they do? And how do you not become fatigued with issues that people fight every single day? So how do you begin to kind of shape your work, your conversations, your information that you receive in a way that's broader than the company you keep? And for me, it's around, how do we get to a place where we're beginning to have a collective conversation about what change looks like?
I'm glad you mentioned voting. Today is National Voting Registration Day. So for those of you who have not registered to vote, please make sure you do, because that is obviously an important part of the civic duty. But let's bring it home a little bit to Atlanta, and let's just pull up the audience. Who is actually from Atlanta? Who is from the South? Okay, so you can kind of see. So as we know, in Atlanta, we all know the stats. It has one of the highest inequality indicators by all accounts. What zip code you come from has a huge indication on how you end up in life. And that's just the basis of the inequalities that start even before one is born. We are all citizens and residents of Atlanta at this point. How do you think Atlanta needs to get beyond this current statistic? What needs to be done for Atlanta, especially in terms of the remedies that you call for?
Atlanta's a very special place, where we've always been plagued with this dichotomy of, not only the haves and the have-nots, but who speaks and who doesn't, for whom and when. We've had this system of closed door activism that I think that has driven the city for many years.
What's closed door activism mean?
I think where a select group of folks in Atlanta have driven both the narrative and in some ways the outcomes for the city. Oftentimes, a city like Atlanta is when you know the history of Atlanta, that it's a very business driven city. We have done a fantastic job through the leadership in this city of branding who and what we are as a city. We are Black Mecca, with the city too busy to hate. Now we influence everything. I wear my t-shirts. So we are fantastic at telling people who we are and what we want to be. And that's Atlanta's great for that. And it's why I love Atlanta. But the reality of it is that it goes beyond the branding, right? Like we've got to make sure that we hold people accountable, even the folks that look like us and we love very much, for change. Right now, trying to get a place to live in the city of Atlanta is almost impossible. Rent is astronomical. Our education system needs addressing in a variety of ways. There are communities in Atlanta that are plagued with so much violence and so much lack of opportunity that I don't want to use the word, that's a too harsh of a word. I don't want to say that, but it worries me. It keeps me up at night. In 2016, I helped to co-found an organization called the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative to address the racial wealth gap. And what we knew over time is that the gap, and I'm saying this in relationship to Atlanta, the gap is at the time, there was a lot of data coming out that it was like a 270 or 280 year runway to close that racial wealth gap. That's if white people remained stagnant. They didn't move. They didn't grow. Economic growth did not hit. That's like if white people stayed still and Black people had the opportunity to grow, we could close the racial wealth gap in like, hundreds of years. And what we realized in that over the past few years was that might not have been the right question to ask. And that might not have been the right hypothesis to lead on. And what we've done through the leadership of Dr. Janelle Williams and others, we are leading with the lens around how do we help build Black wealth? We are redefining what wealth looks like. And that is around community, that is around collective ownership, that is around principles that are defined by the communities themselves. We see a lot of other communities do this as well. Black folks ain't the first to do this, okay? But we do know that defining ourselves off of a system and a standard that has not always looked after Black and brown people does not really make much sense. And so my challenge for Atlanta is what makes sense for Atlanta? We want change. We want growth. We want diversity. We want that. That's not the argument here. But if a group of people in Atlanta that look a certain way, that have built this city, that have been here for generations, do not have the same opportunity as everyone else that wants to grow and influence everything, that is a challenge. And we need to see these people. We need to see our neighbors in different ways. And so that's what I challenge us to do, to redefine what Atlanta looks like, redefine what influence looks like, redefine what a city too busy to hate looks like, redefine what a Black Mecca looks like. Let's redefine that. And we need leadership that is looking for new solutions to do that. And sometimes that's saying, while we appreciate what works or what worked, it really didn't work, and we're still here. And so I think we need to ask different questions to our leaders and hold them differently accountable. And I don't think we should wait for folks to be elected into leadership to be leaders. I think we could really, I've seen some of the most powerful leaders organize their neighbors and have had amazing impact on change in their neighborhoods. And I think we can continue to do that.
I love how you have a redefine in wealth, because at the partnership, we think about shared economic prosperity and how we need to couple financial capital with social.
Yes.
Because it's not enough to get a grant and expect, things to magically change. It's more, how do you couple that with the social wealth that needs to be built in terms of the institutions, the networks, who you need to know, how can we collectively help you succeed? And to that end, I like the term that you said without closed door activism.
Mm-hmm.
What is the opposite? I mean, you kind of defined it in terms of what it should look like, but what does that actually mean if the status quo or the past is a closed door activism? What should we be striving for in terms of that welcoming or more open door action?
Transparent decision making. Oftentimes decisions are made before they come to the public. We've seen recent examples of that, and you see how people have responded to that. And regardless if it's the right decision or wrong decision to make, we can't keep making decisions on behalf of people that are not included at that table. We just can't do that. Thank you. I think we need to, there's work in that. When I was with the foundation that I was with before, the Candida Fund, that was a part of the investments that we were making. We were making bets on, not even bets, we were making investments. We were partnering with folks that were cultivating voices outside of the traditional actors in Atlanta. And so we were funding the Center for Civic Innovation, the Partnership for Southern Equity. We were funding efforts that were looking at different models, Village Micro Fund, the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. We were looking for folks who were challenging different efforts in Atlanta. We were funding chief equity officers in Atlanta public schools and chief housing officers in Atlanta to have an equity lens, to look differently at that work. Not because we knew the way as a foundation, but we had to invest in the people so they could wake up in the morning and think about this every day. And so it's not necessarily the solution, but I do think that there is a responsibility of partners like you and others to challenge how leadership shows up, but not only that, making sure that questioning whether or not that's the right leadership at the table. Just because you work for a big corporation in Atlanta doesn't make your voice any stronger or more clear. And just because you may work in a service role in a big company doesn't mean your voice is any less important. And so we need to figure out where those spaces to bring those to the table. And we got to challenge ourselves when they're not there or they're there too long.
Yeah, no. And we very much agree with bringing more chairs, making it a bigger table, and bringing more voices in.
Or start a new table.
Yes, or even open space. Mm-hmm. No table is necessary sometimes.
That's right.
We do it through intentional collisions. And what I mean by that is that we try to bring groups, organizations, and people that might not come together. And how do we actually provide the space, the opportunities for us to come out? How can, from a very practical level, how can a business school student come work together with an engineer, work together with a social scientist, work together with a public policy? And what kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach can become with that? Because if you put everything from an engineering perspective, for instance, you might just get an engineering solution. But if you create multidisciplinary kind of teams, it becomes a bigger, more holistic solution. And you can kind of create that with more public-private partnerships, more different organizations. Your R1s can work with an R2 or a smaller liberal arts college. Lots of different ways to cut across this matrix and form these types of collaborations. But it has to be very intentional in terms of understanding who's missing and who's not in the room. But Téne, we see a sea of younger younger folks in the room. What, just slightly, yeah, just slightly younger. What is your advice for the younger or young people in the room as they try to navigate this complex landscape, especially in terms of staying the course and really driving home that just and equitable world that you are envisioning?
So, Deborah spoke that I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know I don't look like it, but you know, no, I'm kidding. But here's 20 plus years ago, I was a young student at Georgia State University. I was very active in the community. I was head of my NAACP chapter as part of the young, Dems. I was progressive. I was marching. I was throwing things around, volunteering. And, I just thought like in my time as a college student, the world was definitely getting ready to change because of me, like because I had that much impact on the world. And I mean, in some ways, I think that's important. And I think that's exactly what you should do. The one thing I can tell you now, that I still remain that activist. I still remain that rebel rouser. I still like the challenge. But to tell myself which would have saved me a little bit of embarrassment and a little bit of heartache, was to remain curious. I think that there's a point in time where generationally, and everybody goes through it, we know much more than the generation ahead of us, right? I'm like, those 40-year-olds are old. They don't know. They've been around too long. They just been doing the most. They need to move out of the way. Those old people. Let me through. I know. I got the energy. I got the spunk. I can tell them what to do. They're doing that wrong. Like, why would they even do it that way? That's so stupid. Like, we now have a Facebook thing. Like, like it was, whatever. Here's now we don't have dial-up. So I think that, so I will just say that as a leader, the best leaders are curious. The best leaders ask a question before they give the answer. And that is something that I will just, I talk to young people a lot about that. And it's because they get so frustrated so quickly, as I did, and I do, around the pace of change. It's not happening fast enough. Or as Deborah and I talked about, I was like, actually, change actually does happen fairly quickly. But when you want to see the results of that change, you want to see the impact of that change, you want to see the sustainability of that change, that is what time gives you. And that is nuance. That is pressure, applied pressure. That is over time. And so my advice to young people is to remain curious, ask questions, push, be patient, have a sense of urgency, but also listen. Because I think sometimes we forget that it's not just about you. You got to bring this whole room around before there can be impact. And that takes time. And so a spark can happen very quickly. But if you want to change everything, it's going to take more than just you. So that's the stuff I tell people every day.
Yeah, I would add, we can also challenge ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable at times too.
You were talking about social capital, and I've been really thinking through this concept around what is my social capital calculator? Mm-hmm. Meaning who around me is pushing me around the work that I'm doing. Naturally, I work in a world where I'm definitely in a variety of ways in the minority. I'm from the South, African-American woman. I didn't go to an Ivy. There's a lot of things in my world where I stick out. But I force myself on a constant basis to make myself uncomfortable and to learn and to ask questions and to listen and to be in spaces where I can just be and be challenged. And when I become uncomfortable, I get up and leave because nobody wants that. Well, not when I become uncomfortable, when I feel like I'm being violated, I leave. Let me be clear. But you do need to push yourself to be uncomfortable. You do need to ask yourself, I love my friends. We are all great, but we're actually all the exact same people. And we have not pushed ourselves to be in different spaces. And I say that for people that look like me, people who don't look like me, that if everyone around you has a very similar profile than you, then I'm not quite sure you're pushing your thinking to create the change that you want to see.
Correct.
So.
Thank you. Yes. And I have one more question, and I know we're going to open it up for additional questions. So please start thinking what questions you want to ask Téne, because this is very much the fireside chat that we envision, where it's going to be more interactive. But Téne, last question. You talked a little bit about what keeps you up at night.
Mm-hmm.
What helps you fall asleep at night at the end of the day? What gives you hope?
I was thinking like, because I'm an adult, I'm like, oh, a nice beverage. Nice cab. I would say, to be honest with you, what gives me hope is this generation that's sitting in front of me, and I get to work with at Emory. And I get to work with every day at Urban. I am so, look, the level of brilliance that exists with this, and this is not me like pandering, like I literally just sit and listen to like 20 to 40-year-olds every day, and I'm like, how do you know this? How do you know that? Who told you that? And then you just come with like a level of like brilliance and passion and focus that I'm just very, very like impressed by. So I go to bed pretty easily knowing like in a few years y'all gonna be hiring me to do something. So I feel good about that. Just issues that they're tackling, the environment, like just really complex issues that I think they don't have to do collectively. And I'm just really encouraged by like what's this next generation. I know I'm not gonna have to work until I'm like 100. I'm gonna stop early. That's great.
And I think that answer alone shows you how Téne practices servant leadership to its fullest extent. Very much given and receiving in that circle. Any questions? And if you don't mind standing up and just briefly introducing yourself, that would be great. It's a small group, so don't worry. I'm happy to repeat too.
Dixon, thank you for being here. You talked about, making yourself feel uncomfortable, and then you segue into when you feel violated, you leave. Do you mind unpacking that a little more in regards to, of course, you can't get up and walk out of everything, right? But what are some of those indicators, parameters to help you identify when you've had enough and it's no longer a psychological safe place to be?
Everyone get that question?
Everybody.
Yep.
Okay. Well, one thing is when it doesn't come up, when it's not learning, right? When you're like, I'm not learning anything from this space at this point. I am being violated. This doesn't feel like I'm getting something out that I can share with other people. There are moments, oftentimes I will say this, and I will say this to anybody. If you're in a space where I don't want to talk. I'm trying to give a very tactical response to that. There becomes a point in time where it becomes less about the other person, and then you start to have that internal talk with yourself, and that self-talk is telling you to, it's like flight. What is it called? Something fight or flight. When that talk starts to happen, you got to go. You got to ask yourself what is triggering that, and then you got to go, right? Because some of it is based on who you are, right? It's coming from some real life experiences that you should not have to hold in those moments. Not your responsibility to hold that. Being uncomfortable, let me distinguish this because this is just going to be helpful for me. When you are a person of color in this, and I'm only going to speak about this from a racial equity lens, can easily talk about this as a woman, can easily talk about this from a variety of different perspectives, but I'm going to talk about this from a racial lens, right? A racialized lens, right? So if you're a person of color and you are in a space where you are no longer being seen as a whole human, when you are no longer being seen as someone as a contributor, when you are no longer being seen as someone who should be there, you need to just go. I don't care what environment this is. I don't care. And not because you are running away from something, is because you have to protect who you are. And I also will say to you, we've also have to find ways to address these harms that do not harm us. How do you begin to craft language that does not harm you, but you need to communicate that a harm has been done? We've got to get there. And that's a lot of work. And I've spent a lot of my career doing that, right? Very recently, there was an example where someone, which this word should not have been a trigger, but it was for me. Someone said, you're great, you're amazing, but it's something about your confidence that just like, this was before Deion started talking about confidence. Deion Sanders. This was in a moment where and what triggered to me was I've always been told I needed to be confident when I show up in the room. I needed to be self-assured. I need to assure the other person. I need to assure myself that the job can get done, that the decisions that I make is the right decision. For 20 years, I've been a grant maker. So all I do is make decisions, and all I have to be is confident about those decisions. So when someone tells you that bothers them and that makes them uncomfortable, I'm like, well, what is that about? Like, we need to unpack that. And so the older I get, I'm learning that every situation isn't a flight moment, even when I'm uncomfortable. And it's a moment for me to address the harm. Sometimes you got to address the harm to feel safe. And that takes, every situation doesn't call for that, but everyone is not always trying to inflict harm on you because of their ignorance. And so you have to begin to learn the skill of discernment as a leader in this work, and to know when to address that harm head on, and when that harm is traumatic and there's no fixing it. I can't, unfortunately, as a person in this work, it is moment to moment. I wish I could be like, this is the scenario. I've been completely caught off guard in moments of harm, and I could not address it because it was so like, wait a minute. But I've also learned, because of those patterns of harm, the older I've gotten, is that, okay, everything doesn't have to come to me as a shock. Let me go ahead and address it at this point. Mentorship helps. In my situation, right? So, and I'll also say this for white folks that are in this work that are looking on trying not to inflict harm on people. In 2020, going into 2021, I actually stopped doing work around dismantling racism. Like, I was like, I can't do this. Let me tell you why. Because I ain't caused it. I was like, I don't know nothing about racism except being affected by it, right? Like, I didn't create no system of racism. All right. I actually changed my frame to a liberatory framework. So I work from a place of liberation. So when it comes to the work that I do around racial equity, it's always around how can we collectively in this situation understand the path forward, understand the historical wrong and the path forward. How do we celebrate that? How do we acknowledge that? How do we heal from that? And how do we move forward? But in that same time of me acknowledging my liberatory framework, I had to do some work with people around me to say, I think you need to get with folks who are like you and have a conversation and educate yourselves on the work that you need to do to dismantle this historical wrong that, not because of you, but you get to be a beneficiary of. The same way I'm a beneficiary of negative historical wrongs, there are a group of people who get the benefit from the privilege of inflicting that harm. And so we need to address that. But I can't do that. So there's a series of work that's actually happening in the social sector and beyond around white folks getting in spaces where they can do their work And I think that's important. And I think that's healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. And so that's some of the work that I talk about when it comes to harm. Like, oh, this isn't a Téne issue. This is you probably need to go read, like, right fragility issue, right? Like that you need to, there's a whole book about that. I didn't just make it up. There's a whole book around that. And I think that's some work that we can talk about without it becoming something else.
There's some common themes that you keep iterating on, which is stay curious, do the work, and really the collaboration, mentorship, partnership theme that I think is essential to this fight. Who has a mentor in this room? Who is a mentee? Who serves as a mentor? So obviously, Georgia Tech, as you know, has a lot of resources for mentorship, both as a mentor. You can also be a mentor and being a mentee. So I encourage you to look for that, because I think having a mentor really does help you navigate a lot of these more complicated societal as well as personal and career challenges along the way.
It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be this
and it could be a peer, I would say. I'm like, Téne, there are some sticky situations going on.
Same.
How can you help me with this? She might not help me. She might just give me a cup of coffee, but that is helpful, I will say. So please look to each other as well when you're navigating these questions. So a couple more minutes, so we can take one more question maybe.
Thank you. So I'm a dual degree, getting an MBA and a master's in estate planning. A lot of the work you're in is stuff I do as well, community development. I guess my question is, your career has been in the nonprofit public sector. A lot of that work is negotiating with the private sector. So is there like a reason you decided to go public versus private? And like, how do you navigate those two spaces if you're trying to decide which path to go?
Well,
Did everyone hear that?
Like how do you navigate the
Public-private sector?
Yeah.
Why do you stay in one sector versus another sector?
In this type of work, yeah.
Yeah. Well, one, it's all interconnected. It's all intersectional, right? Like, these issues don't stop short of a grant. They don't stop short of a city council meeting. And now I'm in DC. It doesn't stop short of federal funding or, some decision that's made. It doesn't stop short of that. It's all very interconnected. And so it was very easy for me to build relationships with public partners, to talk about how to leverage, talk about impact, talk about change. You need all these people. So I spent a lot of time with public officials. I spent a lot of time with corporate leaders, philanthropy, nonprofit leaders, trying to understand income, like particularly issues right now. So entrepreneurship was a big issue that needed all those folks to be in a room. So we would convene those folks in various ways. I would participate in convening. Groups like I mentioned them earlier, partnership. I'm looking at Chris, Partnership for Southern Equity does a great job, like creating that intersection of all those different folks. And oftentimes what happens is, I think, is that, we need more leaders, and not even leaders. We need more people, period, to say, well, where are the opportunities to bridge our resources? And how do we know we've done a good job? And I think that happens where, the city's doing its budget. They want to put money in parks. How do we leverage that? But the money can only go so far and only can be designated for one thing. So that public leader needs to have a conversation with maybe a philanthropist or a corporate leader to say, we can build the park, but we can't put any of the amenities in there. Can you help support those amenities? And that's when, you start to see a collective. That's when you see community building happening. That's when you see strong community development occur, when it's not just one entity leading an effort, but there's a collective of folks that have invested, have weighed in, including the residents, to make that a reality. I come from a asset-based community development lens. I don't know if Jenny Hirsch is in this room, but hey girl, how are you so but even in that model, it's really around what are the collective, gifts that reside in a community and how are they utilized? And not just acknowledged, but utilized, right? And like what are we doing with them? And so that's a part of the work is making sure that you're setting a table, regardless if you're in the public sector or you're leading a nonprofit that's inclusive of all those voices.
Yeah, and I would just put a plug. So we are a public-private partnership. And I think Téne would agree with this, that all the problems that are the most important, that are critical or valuable, when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about just and caring world, this cannot be solved by any one single sector alone. It's just too complicated, too much. And it's important to build those alliances, not only because you can share the risk, but you're sharing the resources and you're ultimately sharing the reward and the vision and the goal. And so it's by necessity that we actually have to build these alliances and these collaborations. And so when we challenge ourselves, it's really challenging ourselves to think about how do you speak in a common language, knowing the other language to begin with, but then really come up with a common framework and a common language that we can go forward in. And I think that's ultimately, whether you're in the private sector or in the public sector, you have to get involved in that. And getting involved in the other means you have to understand the other and really understand what makes them tick, what drives them, and then be able to move forward in that process. And I think you have definitely tried to do that throughout your zigzag career, navigated and built those alliances. Téne, thank you so much for coming.